Hey, my name is Daniel and welcome back to another Elder Scrolls Betrayal of the Second Era video, and today we're talking all about the Bard class, exploring its support capabilities as well as some potentially game-breaking combos to orchestrate victory. As always, in my class guide videos, I'll be covering everything you need to know about this class, how their abilities work, how and when to upgrade to the master side, which races pair well with them, what starting skill line to choose, what additional skill lines offer good synergy, and what items can enhance the build. And finally, I'll show a bit of gameplay so you could get a sense of how the class actually plays and feels at the table. I'll put timestamps in the description if you want to jump ahead, although I would really appreciate if you stick around for the whole thing. Now, a quick disclaimer: I think figuring things out for yourself is one of the most rewarding parts in this game, and I would encourage everyone to experiment and find their own playstyle. That said, the game can feel a bit overwhelming at first, so this guide is here to help you get started and understand how the class works. And if you're already a seasoned player, I hope you can still find something interesting here too. And now let's get into the guide. As always, we're gonna start off with the innate ability on the Novice side, then I'm gonna talk you through about all the other class abilities, and then I'm gonna switch to the Master side to see what's changed there as well. So Bard's innate ability sets the following: once per any unit's turn, reroll any one die rolled by a unit within 2 hexes of you, including yourself. Now, there are a couple of things to unwrap here. First of all, the word unit refers to basically everyone on the battlefield. That includes adventurers, that includes companion, some kind of quest enemies that are our allies but maybe not necessarily companions. That includes all enemies and even quest enemies. So basically just everyone. And while most class innate abilities, they works only once per turn of your adventure, which is essentially only once per combat round, this class ability is an exception because you can use this on any unit's turn, which means on every unit's turn if you want to, which means essentially multiple times in a combat round. To give you an example how this works, let's say this is our Bard adventurer, let's say they want to roll combat dice in the defensive form to get some shield going up there, and let's say this is what they rolled, just a miss, which is unfortunate. But because we're playing Bard and because we can reroll this even for ourselves, we can just safely reroll this, for hopefully something better, which is 1, clearly better than a miss. This goes to the active slot. Next is the second adventurer's turn, which is in this case this orc, and let's say they want to roll 2 combat dice, and let's say this is the result they get: 1 miss and 1 damage. But because we're playing Bard and because we're staying within 2 hexes of the range from our character, we can reroll any single die that we want. So in this case, let's say we want to reroll this miss, and let's see what we get. Hopefully something better. Yeah, clearly something better. So 2 damage would deal this orc. Now let's say this high elf marauder attacks with a single combat die. Let's see what they roll. So this is what they roll. Oh, they rolled a miss. So our Bard doesn't even need to reroll anything. I'm perfectly fine with that. And now it's the spider's turn. They attack with 2 combat dice, and let's see what they roll. And well, again, 1 miss, 1 combat, and 1 damage. I'm perfectly fine with this, but I could, if I want to reroll this, let's say if this were, another single damage, or maybe this with potentially 2, I think this is the worst result you can get. Let's say I decide to reroll this die, and hopefully we can get, we reduce the damage by 1. Again, this is not a guarantee, but at least you increasing the likelihood of stacking the deck in your favor. And at least whenever you see this number 2, very scary number 2 on the black die, you could totally want to roll that if you can, if you are within range. But the main point is that you can reroll on any unit's turn during a single round, so you can use your ability multiple times in a combat round, which is just awesome. And another thing to keep in mind about this ability is that it says that we can reroll any die, which doesn't say anything about skill dice in particular. That means we can reroll any other dice, including status dice or lockpicking dice. Just any dice that we're rolling, we can reroll this once per any unit's turn, which is just lovely. Moving on to our first class ability, Red Mountain Drinking Song. What a name! For 1 tenacity, interrupt after deploying enemies, deal 1 true damage to up to 2 enemies that were just deployed. Let's say we are in a delve, we trigger exploration and we're revealing a new delve tile, and let's say it says populated with 2 enemies, something like that. And we can choose to spend 1 tenacity to interrupt, and at this very moment we deal 1 true damage to enemies that were just deployed. So essentially, this Argonian bandit would essentially deployed with 2 health instead of 3, and the same for this high elf marauder. Instead of 5 health, they would be deployed essentially with just 4 health. But because in delves in particular we deploy enemies every time we reveal a new delve tile, of course provided that the delve card instructs you to deploy enemies, but let's say we're going to another exploration hex and we reveal it another delve tile like so, and let's say we're deploying more enemies, something like that, and we can choose to trigger that ability again to deal more damage to these enemies that were just deployed. So let's say this spider, -1 health, so 4 instead of 5, and the same for this wood elf Dada, 4 health instead of 5, which is pretty nice. And even though it's just a single 1 damage, because it's true damage, it's still very welcome against very high shielded enemies with high defense like this wood elf Deadeye, or against stalwart enemies like this spider, one of the nastiest enemies in the entire game. Yeah, it's just very welcome. And I'd say this kind of the general theme or the general identity of the Bard class as a whole. Those class abilities that don't deal crazy amount of damage, they don't one-shot enemies like some other class abilities can do, but they can just provide a little bit of help here and there, which is honestly, it's kind of significant. When enemies deploy with 1 fewer health, especially high defense enemies or stalwart enemies, you increase the likelihood of defeating them easily. You can swing in the balance towards the adventurers, especially with your reroll innate ability, that you can hopefully reroll their critical strikes instead of dealing 2 damage, hopefully for a miss or for just a single damage. Yeah, you swing in the balance towards adventurers, which makes the game easy, much more pleasant, honestly. Yeah, I think Bard is a very, very welcome class in any group composition or even in solo. Trust me, you're gonna love this ability and innate ability. Yeah, it's just awesome. And again, even though it's just a single bit of damage, don't underestimate this, especially when you're playing in true solo. Sometimes that's all you need to defeat a really strong enemy, and especially if you use some particular skill lines that maybe can check what's the enemy's health relative to your health. So yeah, it's just really, really helpful to kind of chip away this little health here and there. This is a tremendous help. Moving on to the second class ability, Stagger and Sway. For 1 tenacity interrupt, when a party member engages an enemy, they may ignore 1 defense on that enemy. Now, the timing of this effect was a little bit of a debatable topic in the community, because it says when a party member engages, and engage is a kind of multi-step process where you're declaring a target, you switching your battle form, you're rolling the die, you're resolving the die, you're going through some different steps. So when exactly that when happens in this ability, that was the question. I always played it in a way that you can first see the result of your roll dice or your party member, and then you can decide whether you use this interrupt ability or not. But some people said that you only do this when you kind of declare in your engage, so even before rolling the dice. As you can imagine, this is a pretty big deal. Let's say we have this Imperial Bandit sitting with the last health chip and it has 1 defense, and let's say we rolled this result of combat dice with a number 2, which means that would be already enough to defeat this anyway, and so we didn't need to spend our tenacity for interrupt. But conversely, let's say if we rolled this result of 1, then we would want to make sure to certainly use this ability to hopefully finish it off. So the timing of this effect is really important, and to give you a definitive answer how this ability actually plays, I asked the Chip Theory Games community manager to clarify this for us. And here is the official answer, that the Bard can decide whether to use this ability after rolling the die, which makes this ability is very welcome. I think honestly, this is how I play this anyway, but I want to make sure that everyone plays correctly, including myself, of course, so I was really happy that this was the official clarification. I think this ability is pretty nice, and again, it continues the theme of this Bard's class identity as not necessarily a big damage dealer, but a really just solid utility, and again, stacking the deck in your favor when you deploy enemies with 1 fewer health, thanks to Red Mountain Drinking Song, and now you hopefully finish them off easily thanks to the Stagger and Sway when you ignore 1 defense, which sometimes can be a big difference. So yeah, I just like it. Our next class ability, Pilgrim on the Road, for 2 tenacity, gain the Bard Harder side quest if not already gained. Now, why would you need this side quest? And that is because completing this side quest is your upgrade requirements to becoming a Master Bard. So for now, we're gonna skip discussing this side quest because we're gonna talk through about it in more details in the upgrading to the Master side section of this video. But I will say though that whenever you gain a very first 2 tenacity, use this ability to gain this side quest. Trust me, you would want to upgrade to the Master side as quick as you can, and this side quest is pretty easy. So yeah, the faster you'll get it, the quicker you get it, the faster you'll become a Master Bard, which is pretty big deal. Moving on to the next class ability, Hear the Hist Speak. For 3 tenacity, if you are in magic battle form, apply a dazed status die to up to 2 targetable enemies. First of all, it requires magic battle form, and depending on how you level up, how you advance your character, you may or may not always be in that magic battle form, depending on your skill lines, whether you're leaning more heavily towards magic or kind of physical type of damage and archetype. So yeah, this is just something to keep in mind. Also, targetable enemies, in this particular case, it means that the range of where enemies are targetable for you is limited by your magic stat. So again, depending on the archetype they are going through, whether you want to lean more towards magic or kind of physical based archetype, you sometimes even want to untrain magicka. So if you don't have magicka at all, it means you won't have any targetable enemies, and again, this is something to keep in mind. But in this particular case, let's say this is our adventurer, and let's say they have 3 magicka and they are in magic battle form, so they can use this ability for spending 3 tenacity, applying 2 daze status to up to 2 targetable enemies. And the way daze work, it essentially allows enemies to either move or attack, but not both. So let's say this Imperial Marauder moved here, and because it moved, it can't attack anymore, so these days go away. So this is pretty nice against melee enemies. I quite like this as a defensive option. But let's say this Orc Wizard, it has a range of 9, which it means it doesn't even need to move, which means regardless of being dazed, it's still able to target our adventurer regardless of daze. So yeah, this is why I think that's kind of the weakest point of daze status as a whole, because it's not so much, it's less effective against ranged enemies. Maybe sometimes there are, range 2 or 3 and you can kind of move away after applying daze, so that will be pretty nice. But sometimes when you have range 8, that's pretty much, totally useless, frankly. Overall, I think this ability can be pretty nice, especially if you are playing as a more supportive role to your other adventurers, and especially if you are leaning more towards kind of magicka supporting archetype, then this is again pretty useful. But if you're playing in solo, I think there are just better ways of spending tenacity, especially once you upgrade to the master side. And the last class ability on the novice side, 3 hearts as 1. For 3 tenacity, for each fatigue die in your cooldown track, heal adventurers for a collective total of 2 health. Since this ability refers to fatigue, and fatigue includes both light fatigue and over fatigue, and so in this particular case, let's say we're sitting with 4 fatigue dice in our cooldown track, and so 2 times 4 means we can heal all adventurers in play for a collective total of 8 health, distributed as we want. I think this is a fantastic healing ability. Generally speaking, you have no shortage of fatigue in this game in your cooldown track, and especially if you are playing on the expert difficulty, where for each additional engage you need to add 2 light fatigue to your cooldown track instead of 1. So yeah, you pretty much always have at least 3 to 4 fatigue in your cooldown track, especially if you're doing multiple engages in a turn, and so you can pretty much always heal your entire party for, I would say, minimum of 6, 8, again depending on how much fatigue you have in your cooldown track, but yeah, this is really strong. Of course, when you're playing solo, most of the times you don't even need that much amount of healing, and keep in mind that for this particular ability, your healing cannot exceed your health stat, so it's not kind of, you cannot overheal essentially. And honestly, I wish it had a little bit more flexibility, maybe where you would choose to spend X amount of tenacity to heal for 2 health for, X amount of fatigue in your cooldown track or something like that. Because oftentimes I find that I need only 1 or 2 healing, that's how much I need to get to the maximum health, but I don't want to spend 3 tenacity for that. So I think it's a little bit awkward when you play in solo, because as I said, just most of the times you don't need that much healing, but it's a very welcome healing ability when you're playing with more adventurers. Now let's talk about how to become a master bard, and this is where this Bard Harder side quest comes in handy. Now if you are lucky, you can of course gain this side quest essentially for free by spending a town action, but honestly I would just suggest spending 2 tenacity for your Pilgrim on the Road ability to guaranteed gain this side quest to complete this as quick as you can. So in order to complete this quest, you need to complete the following kind of sub-tasks equal to the party size in numerical order. For example, if you are playing solo, you only need to complete the first task on this card. If you are playing with 2 adventurers, you need to complete the first and the second, and the same for 3 adventurers and 4 adventurers. Keep in mind that you must complete these tasks in numerical order, which means let's say if you are playing with 2 adventurers, you cannot complete task 2 and then get back to task 1. It has to be in order, first, second, third and fourth, just like so. And honestly, I'm really glad that this side quest scales with the number of players, because otherwise it would be pretty tedious for a single player, but the way it works is kind of makes it easier Really, if you're playing solo, it's very easy, and if you're playing with 4 players, it's not that hard either. So if you're playing solo, all you have to do is to complete the first task, which says, no way I'm going to eat this stew, and as a free town action, adventurers must discard a collective total of 4 items, with food counts as 2 items for this task. For this reason, for your very first town encounter, I would highly suggest grabbing some food items if you can, if they are available on the market, because this will really come in handy. If you get lucky and if you have several of these food types of items, you can potentially complete this side quest even on the day 3, of course provided that you gain 2 tenacity to gain this quest in the first place. But yeah, as soon as you have some food items, grab them, they will really come in handy. Now for 2 players, level 20 enemy means that your enemy pool has to be at least 10 in order to deploy level 20 enemies, so this will take a little bit of time depending on how quickly you prioritize certain quests or encounters. You might have this only by the end of the session 1 or maybe by day 5, again depending on how quick you gain experience. But yeah, keep in mind that if you're playing with 2 players, that probably won't be as fast as you're playing on solo. And also because it says that an adventurer must defeat a level 20 enemy, so it doesn't have to be you, it doesn't have to be Bart specifically, it can be your party member, which is really good. So yeah, as soon as you get your enemy pool of 10, then you can complete this part of this quest. Task 3 of this quest says you need to complete one other side quest, and again this depends on the luck of the draw. Those side quests sometimes they take a little bit of time, sometimes they need a little bit of luck, but yeah, generally speaking you need to complete this in order to become master if you're playing with 3 players. And for the group of 4, it says each adventurer must have at least 1 level 4 skill die trained. Now in order to train a level 4 skill die, you need to spend at least 7 experience, of course provided that you're not spending them on anything else, so this again might take you quite a few days before you can do that. So depending on how your party prioritize your must-have grade quicker or not, this might take some time, but other than that, I think it's gonna inevitably will happen once you progress through the game. Upon completion of each task, you can mark it by this health chip to indicate that the task is completed, and once they're all done according to the number of adventurers, you can essentially instantly complete this quest. You don't even need to visit a town or anything like that, and as a bonus you gain 1 experience and up to 5 tenacity, which is pretty nice. And of course, most importantly for this class, you get promoted to the Master Bard, which is awesome. On the Master side, our innate ability got some nice upgrade. It says now, once per any unit's turn, reroll 1 die rolled by a unit within 4 hexes of you, including yourself. So the only difference is in range. Instead of 2 hexes away, now it's 4 hexes away, and honestly this does make quite a big difference. Let's say in this particular case we have our fellow adventurer standing 3 hexes away from our bard, and we have enemies standing 4 hexes away from our bard. So normally on the innate side we wouldn't be able to reroll their dice, but now we can, and this makes quite a big difference. Even when you are playing solo, let's say you don't have another adventurer in play, this change is still very welcome, especially in dungeons or some kind of long delves where you have sometimes monsters, deploying on a further away hexes from you, so they shoot from the distance. Sometimes the distance is more than 2 hexes, so yeah, just being able to reroll at 4 hexes is quite a nice quality of life improvement, if you will. Moving on to our first upgraded class ability on the Master side, Red Mountain Drinking Song. It says for 1 tenacity interrupt, after deploying enemies, deal 1 true damage to up to 3 enemies that were just deployed. So instead of dealing damage to up to 2 enemies like it was on the Novice side, we can now do the same for up to 3 enemies that were just deployed. So if they were just deployed like so, we would chip away another little health, and yeah, this is pretty nice. I think this is a pretty nice upgrade. We can hit up to 3 enemies, lowering down their health is pretty nice, and I especially like this ability in delves since you can use this multiple times whenever enemies are deployed. I like using this ability in the beginning of the game where you normally don't have a big burst of damage yet, and so every bit of health really counts, and I think it stays relevant throughout the whole game. Even in the late endgame dungeons, it's still pretty nice to chip away some health, especially with some dangerous, high defense enemies. So yeah, I think overall is a pretty welcome upgrade and nice ability overall. The next ability, Stagger and Sway, stays exactly the same, and honestly I'm perfectly fine with this. I think if this would ignore 1 extra defense that could be a little bit too overpowered, so yeah, I think the balance wise it's perfect as it is, so yeah, I'm totally fine with this. But now moving on to the next ability, which was not available on the Novice side at all, that is the Tale of Sirabane. For 2 tenacity, choose an adventurer in sight, that adventurer recovers one drained or exhausted die. And honestly, I think this is the ability why you should prioritize upgrading your bard to the master as quick as you can, because this ability is just so good. So just to explain you how powerful this ability is, let's say this is our dice, and of course don't have any stats, but yeah, just for the demonstration purposes, let's say we're rolling this die, which is Cleave, level 4 die from the two-handed skill line, very powerful, scales with your health or stamina. Again, super strong ability, we deal tons of damage with that, and this die goes to your cooldown track as normal because it's exhausted, but we can then spend 2 tenacity if we have it, of course. Then we recover this die, and essentially what it allows us to do is to roll this die again, so we're making another engage by gaining 2 light fatigue if you're playing an expert, and you're dealing crazy damage again. And this essentially allows you to do this every single turn. You can roll dice twice. I mean, you can roll them, you can resolve them, they go to your cooldown track, and then you can play them. You can recover them, and then you can play them again, which is just absolutely ridiculous. And of course, this ability works not only on exhausted dice, but also on drained dice, which makes it even more powerful, because generally speaking, some of the most powerful dice in this game are drained, or well, at least some of them. And let's say this level 2 die from the two-handed skill line Onslaught, this particular side deals 5 damage, and because it's so powerful for a single die, this die gets drained, so it goes off your mat, and normally that would be the end for most classes, but because you're playing bard, you can for 2 tenacity recover this, it goes back to your ready slots, then you can roll this again, which is just awesome. I think this ability is universally good regardless of what archetype or what skill lines, what role you're playing, whether you're playing solo, like full-blown damage dealer, you're absolutely happy to recover extra dice from your cooldown track to make another engage, deal extra damage, or if you're playing, let's say, at a more like a supportive role, you're still absolutely happy to do that because it works on other adventurers as well, and it works for adventurers in sight, which is generally even longer than range, again, depending on, of course, on the particular kind of tile or dungeon layout, but yeah, again, you pretty much always can target your adventurers or yourself with this dice, and it's so flexible. It's so universally applicable to any skill line, and I just love it. I think this particular ability is what makes bards pretty tenacity hungry, pretty power hungry. So whenever you have tenacity, you kind of want to spend them on this particular ability because it's so good. And if you can even use this every turn. So yeah, I think this kind of gives the direction of certain items or certain skill lines that kind of synergistic with that. Because unlike in some other classes where you maybe don't want or don't have enough class abilities that you want to spend every turn or every round, but for this bard ability, you absolutely totally want to spend this tenacity whenever you have it to use this the Tale of Sirobane. Moving on to the next class ability, Hear the Hist Speak. Now it costs 2 tenacity instead of 3, which honestly doesn't make a big difference for me, especially now since we have the Tale of Sirobane, which is just so good. For the same 2 tenacity, I would rather recover drained or exhausted die. I think it's much more useful in pretty much any situation. But yeah, it's just nice. The cost reduction is pretty nice. Again, if you're playing in a more supportive role, especially if you're leaning more heavily towards Magicka, then this is pretty welcome upgrade. But yeah, other than that, I think it's pretty okay. The next ability is 3 Hearts as 1. It stays exactly the same as it was on Novice side. No changes whatsoever, and I'm pretty fine with this. Again, I would hope that it would be a little bit more flexible ability for the solo plays, particularly where you would spend X amount of tenacity to heal for X amount of health. But hey, I think it's still useful. Yeah, again, just because we have the Tale of Sirobane, I'm pretty much always happy to spend my tenacity on that ability, so we quite rarely use 3 Hearts as 1, but again, I'm glad this ability exists when you need it. And the final ability of the Master Bard, which was not available on the Novice side at all, that is the Battle of Glenumbra Moors. For 5 tenacity, choose an adventurer. That adventurer removes all light fatigue from their cooldown track and takes an immediate turn. Your turn resumes when this turn ends. So this essentially is an extra turn that you can give to any adventurer. Of course, an adventurer includes yourself as well. So if you're playing solo, you can give yourself an extra turn. If you're playing in party, you can give an extra turn to any other adventurer. This is so good. It's kind of similar to the orcs' racial ability when they gain over fatigue to immediately perform an extra turn, but this is even better because instead of gaining over fatigue, you instead remove all your light fatigue, and this happens before your turn. So first, let's say we have this 2 light fatigue and the skill die in our cooldown track, but we have only the recovery, our cooldown of the value of 2. So if we spend 5 tenacity to use this ability, we first would remove all light fatigue from our cooldown track, and then the turn begins, and because it's a normal turn, you recover the dice according to your cooldown track. So this would go here, and of course you can move twice again. You can make a first engagement without adding light fatigue to your cooldown track. This is so good, because whenever you need to move or do things, just extra engage, extra recovery. The flexibility of extra turn is just amazing, and I love it. Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to gain 5 tenacity, especially when you have such an awesome ability that costs only 2 tenacity, and of course I'm talking about the Tale of Sirabane, which you would want to use this pretty much every turn. But whenever you need this like a really strong power turn to make a power swing, or maybe in a delve you want to rush forward, so the extra turn is very welcome, and I'm really glad that this option exists. Now let's select a race for our bard, and the first option I would consider is High Elf. I think this is a very solid choice if you want to go full on the supportive role, the kind of support bard archetype, and you're playing with other adventurers. You can even start with the Daedric Summoning skill line, because there are 2 level 1 dice called Bound Armaments that kind of grant additional action to your allies, which is pretty nice for kind of, again, with the theme of the supportive bard. And also the 4 Magicka of High Elf kind of synergizes well with the Hear of the Hist Speaker class ability. For 2 tenacity, you can apply daze to your targetable enemies, and because we have 4 Magicka right away, it means we can apply this to enemies within the range of 4, which is pretty nice again for this full-on supportive role. The same goes for the High Elf racial ability, that way once per battle, you can essentially teleport any adventurer to the entrance tile and heal them for 3 health, which may come in handy, and even though you have 3 hearts as your class ability, because it costs 3 tenacity, and you would generally speaking would rather use your 2 tenacity for the Tale of Sirabane, this just extra passive healing is pretty nice as well. The next race option to consider is Breton. Similar to High Elves, Breton also leaning more towards Magicka with their starting stats, which is again pretty useful if you're going for the supportive role, or maybe as a hybrid between some kind of like a damage dealer and support, so you maybe want to use your light armor or things like that, or other skill lines from the Magic Constellation. And I also quite like Breton's racial ability, because you can essentially use your overtax effects on your weapon or armor more freely, more frequently, and generally speaking they are pretty good, especially once you found some nice decent items, maybe towards the mid or late game in particular. The next race option to consider is Wood Elf, and unlike High Elf and Breton, this goes kind of in the opposite direction of anti-magic, so if you want to kind of advance your character towards physical weapon or kind of physical skill lines, I think Wood Elf, particularly their stats, are very good for that. Whether you want to use a bow or 2-handed or 1-handed shield as your starting skill lines, I think starting with 3 stamina, 5 health and 2 combat dice is just amazing for that. And also the racial ability, once per battle you can stealth up to 2 party members in play. This again provides a little bit more kind of defensive and utility options, which is pretty welcome sometimes. And the final race option to consider for the purpose of this video is Imperial. I think their starting stats are pretty balanced, so regardless of which direction you want to go, whether on the more physical or magic type skills, this is kind of, you can choose anyone you want. But most importantly, their racial abilities once per battle, when you would be dealt 3 or fewer damage, prevents that damage and instead gain that much tenacity. And remember what I said earlier, that Bard is a pretty tenacity hungry class, mostly because of the Tale of Sirabane ability, simply because it's so good, but it's also helpful for the Battle of Glenumbra Moors. If you want 5 tenacity, and it's kind of sometimes hard to gain tenacity because you always reroll in your dice especially, so you kind of reroll your misses, you're maybe not necessarily gaining enough tenacity just through your roll. But this ability definitely helps you to use your ability more often. Now, as I always say, in this game you can pick absolutely any race to pair it with absolutely any class. That's one of the best kind of designs, the overall designs of this game. That's why I love it so much. But I would say, here's my recommendation. If you want to play as a more supportive role, especially with maybe 4 adventurers, then play with High Elf. I think it synergizes well with some of the kind of general supportive role, especially with magic abilities, maybe with some illusion skill line if you have the Valenwood expansion. Now I would say pick Breton if you also want to lean slightly more towards Magicka, but in the meantime you want to have a little bit more flexibility with your racial ability in particular, because there are just so many useful overtax effects and they are so varied, which means kind of a jack of all trades. I think this kind of again goes with the theme with bards because they're kind of so universally good on most of their abilities. Then I would say pick a wood elf if you want to lean more towards kind of physical skill lines, maybe a one-handed shield, a bow, or two-handed, maybe acrobatics, while still providing some utility to your group. I think this is pretty nice. And I'd say for solo play, Imperial might be the best choice, not only because you're gaining more tenacity, but also because you preventing damage, which is more important, especially when you're playing in solo. So for the purpose of this guide, I'm gonna stick to Imperial. Alright, we've got our race, we've got our class, now it's time to build our character. And the way it works is the following. There are round slots on the left and right sides of the adventure mat, where you slot in either attributes and tokens or some skill lines, and then when you advance your character, you're leveling up either those skill lines or stats, either from left to right or from right to left, depending on where it starts, and then those kind of stats and skill lines they sometimes meet in the middle, which opens up a lot of different decisions to make how you want to advance your character. And so for this reason, I'd say it's always useful to have at least a general picture how do you want to advance your character, because you can't swap all the skill lines and tokens in the middle of the game. I'd say Bard is probably one of the most flexible classes in the game, simply because all of its abilities and innate ability are all the utilities, they are so universally applicable to pretty much any role or build. Let's say if you are going for a more tanky role, or more like a pure damage dealing role, or more supportive role, or whether you're going for like a physical damage or like a spellcaster, this can totally work for Bard regardless of your choice. The build I'm making for this particular video will be using a bow skill line with one particular die that I think synergizes perfectly with the Bard's innate ability to reroll and kind of amplifies that even further. So yeah, this kind of crazy build I'm going to build. You'll see it why in a moment once we finish it up there. But I just want to let you know that Bard can be built in absolutely any way you want, and in fact so that I maybe consider making even another build about Bard, just to highlight another kind of more melee variation or maybe spellcaster variation. Frankly, I don't know, but yeah, just want to let you know that for this particular build, I'm going with some crazy bow reroll build. And so first things first, I'm gonna slot in the health stat token on the top left corner for no particular reason, just because I like this spot for health. Next is stamina, and the question is whether to put this either on a new row or across health. And kind of my general thinking about it is because I'm playing a ranged build, which means I'm mostly going to be staying away from enemies, at least that's kind of my hope, and plus because I'm playing Imperial, which once for battle can prevent up to 3 damage, I think I don't need to heavily level up my health for this particular build, so I think I'm gonna slot in my stamina across health, of course alongside its 2 starting corresponding stat tokens. Next is Magicka, and I'm gonna simply put this now on the new row just like so, alongside its 2 stat tokens. Next we have combat, and again similar thought process, similar question, do I want to slot this across Magicka or do I want to slot this on a new row? And I think because it's very unlikely that I'm gonna level up by more Magicka or combat, and I don't want to have a gap between those, so I'll better probably put this on a new row, something like that. But of course 2 starting combat skill dice. And finally, for the starting skill line, as I already mentioned, I'm going for the specific bow archetype for this particular build, so I'm gonna slot in the starting skill line on this row because I pretty much want to level up to maximum probably. So yeah, alongside of course 2 snipe dice. So now let's have a closer look at the bow skill line, and as already mentioned, the starting skill dice, they call it snipe, and they say deal X damage to your target, ignore 1 defense on your target for this engage. So essentially this dice is exactly the same as the combat skill dice when it comes to number of damage. It has the same faces with 1 meets, 4 faces with 1 damage and 1 face with 2 damage. Though of course the big difference comes with ignoring 1 defense for this engage. I think this part of ignoring 1 defense is probably the most confusing across the whole starting skill lines for beginner players, so let me explain how it works. So whenever you roll your snipe dice, you're essentially subtracting 1 defense from the printed value on the enemy chip for each snipe dice rolled. Let's take a look at some examples. Let's say we're rolling this snipe die against the Breton Bandit, and this is the result that we get. Just 1 damage and 1 ignore defense. Since Breton Bandit has 1 defense and we rolled 1 snipe dice that ignored that defense, that essentially 1 minus 1 means 0, so we're essentially treating this Breton Bandit as with 0 defense enemy, and hence why this 1 single die would deal 1 damage to Breton Bandit in this case. To give you another example, let's say we're targeting this Orc Marauder with the same snipe dice, and this is the same face that we get. Since Orc Marauder has a defense 2 and we rolled 1 snipe die, it means 2 minus 1 these enemies still kind of treats them as with 1 defense, and so hence why this die will not deal any damage. Now let's say we're targeting this Orc Marauder again, but this time the dice is landed on this 2 damage side. How that would work? Now, because Orc Marauder still has 2 defense, and we roll 1 snap dice, which still ignores only 1 defense, despite the printed value of 2 damage. So this kind of, we essentially treat this enemy as having just 1 defense, because we're dealing 2 damage, 1 still goes through, so this Orc Marauder would lose 1 health for this engage. Now let's say we're targeting this Orc Marauder again, this time rolling 2 snap dice, and let's say this is the result we get. 2 single damage. How that would work? Well, since Orc Marauder has 2 defense, and we rolled 2 snap dice, and they both stack when it comes to ignoring defense, that means we're ignoring both of this defense. So essentially, 2 defense minus 2 defense means 0 defense. It means both of these damage just kind of pierce through, and that means that Orc Marauder would lose both health chips in this particular case. So I think snap dice can be a little bit mind-boggling when you're just trying to figure out the rules, when you're just starting the game. And yeah, this might be a little bit tricky to figure out exactly how this ignoring defense works, but yeah, you're basically just stacking this for every snap dice that you roll, you're ignoring 1 defense. You can essentially subtracting 1 value for each dice that you rolled, of course, except with the miss. Yeah, if this miss, it doesn't count. So yeah, these are very useful dice. You're gonna love them throughout the whole game because there are so many high defense enemies, both in the beginning but especially towards the late game. So yeah, these are pretty nice. Moving on to the level 2, we have 2 choices between Volley and Acid Spray. And let's take a look at the Acid Spray first. It says select up to 3 targetable enemies and roll 2d6 for each. Apply Bane status die for each enemy with whom you roll a total of 7 or higher. This is another pretty confusing die, so again, let me explain how it works. First of all, you need to actually roll that side, that face that actually has this effect, because there are 2 misses that do nothing, of course, except gaining tenacity. But let's say we roll this result, then we can select up to 3 targetable enemies, which in this case we only have 2, but let's say we can do this for up to 3. And for each of them individually, we need to roll 2 just d6 dice that you use for lockpicking checks. Let's say we're rolling these for Breton Bandit, and the total is more than 7, which is lovely. 6 and 5, definitely more than 7, so with this, Breton Bandit would get Bane status die, and the same individual roll goes against Orc Marauder. In this case, it's actually 7. Just precisely 7, 3 and 4. So this Orc Marauder would gain a status die as well. Remember that because you are a bard, you can reroll those dice as well. Your innate ability doesn't say about skill dice, so it can work on any dice, including these d6. So let's say if we would roll maybe with this result, that would be 5, which is obviously less than 7, and so this way Orc Marauder would not get a Bane status die, which would be unfortunate. So let's say we would reroll this die, and let's see what we get. Well, and you didn't get it either, but yeah, that's the reality sometimes of bard. Yeah, but at least you tried. I think this is actually a perfect illustration of why I'm not a big fan of this die. It's just not too reliable. Maybe if you're playing with more party members where, just 1 hit or miss isn't a big deal, because generally speaking, it's the game tends to go easier when you're playing with multiple adventurers. Sometimes they can deal extra damage, sometimes they can soak a bit of damage, so it may be not as crucial, not as critical, but if you are playing solo and sometimes you can roll poorly even on all of your targets, and that is kind of devastating. So for this reason, when you're playing solo, I trying to be cautious about this particular die. I think it's not very solo friendly, it's not very reliable, so we'll probably go with a volley instead. And the way volley works is that deal a total of 4 damage distributed as you choose among enemies adjacent to you, then place yourself in an unoccupied hex 2 to 4 hexes away from your current hex. And I think this is yet another pretty confusing die for beginners, so let me explain how it works. Normally, when you roll dice from this bow skill line, you need to be in ranged battle form. And as a feature of ranged battle form, you can target enemies that are in range depending on the value of your stamina stat. However, you cannot target enemies that are adjacent to you. And so normally, if I would want to target this Breton Bandit, let's say with a snipe die, I wouldn't be able to do that because they are standing adjacent to our character. So the only way to do that is for my character to move at least 1 hex away in any direction. As long as we are not adjacent, only then we can roll this snipe dice against them. But with a volley die, you can deal damage even to adjacent enemies, and that's kind of the thing. Now, I think the best part of the volley die is that it doesn't say anything about your target. And this is a bit tricky, but bear with me. Let's say we're rolling this snipe die against the Orc Marauder. And this of course would require us to have 3 stamina because we're 3 hexes away, but let's just ignore this part for now. So let's say we're targeting Orc Marauder with snipe dice. This is our engage. And as a part of this engage, we can also roll volley die kind of alongside snipe die, even though we're targeting Orc Marauder, which is not adjacent. So the way we resolve it, that we can deal, let's say, this damage, or not deal damage, depending on the result, to the Orc Marauder, while still deal damage to this Breton Bandit with volley die, even though it's not our target. And that's kind of the beauty of this die. You can then, of course, place yourself 2 to 4 hexes away from your current hex, which is a little nice bonus for extra mobility, especially maybe when you're using this in Delve and you want to kind of progress further to explore more Delves in a single round. This is a little nice extra movement that goes kind of beyond your extra normal movement action. And so all in all, I'd say even though Acid Spray might deal more damage, especially if you're dealing with some kind of high defense enemies that have maybe 3 defense, because Bane goes through all those defense, dealing 1 true damage every turn, and yeah, depending on how many turns this Bane can last, this can deal a crazy amount of damage. But I would say Volley is slightly more reliable, even though not as not as damage dealing as Acid Spray potentially, but yeah, frankly more reliable, and especially since the fact that you can deal damage to your adjacent enemies without even targeting them, this is like icing on the cake. I really like this. Moving on to the level 3, we have 3 options of Vine Dusk Training, Rapid Fire and Arrow Barrage. And remember that I told you that I'm going for a very specific build that heavily relies on a very specific die, and that die is Arrow Barrage. So I'm just gonna slot it right away. I'm gonna explain it how it works in a moment, but I just want to let you know that I probably will be using some other dies for other builds, for other classes, other characters. So I'm not gonna explain Vine Dusk Training and Rapid Fire in this video, but bear with me, probably for the Archer build or some other classes that will use bow, I'm going back to those dice to explain how they work. But for now, let's just focus on the Arrow Barrage, because this is absolutely crucial and frankly kind of the only die we heavily lean on in this build. So the way Arrow Barrage works is pretty tricky. First of all, you roll this dice and let's see what we get. Yeah, this side deals 2 damage. The kind of gambling part is that you can choose to roll this die again without exhausting it. So let's say that will be 2 damage, then we roll it again, oh that's another 2 damage, then we roll it again, another 2 damage, that's already 6 damage with a single die. And let's say, well, that's another 2 damage, that's already 8, just let me save some time, and yeah, let's say we rolled this result finally. This means you must resolve it, and you either dealt true damage, which is pretty nasty, unless you drain all skill dice rolled during this engage. So if this would be a single die, that means it's a single die that we would be drained. Or let's say if we would roll this alongside snipe die and we get this result, we either take 2 true damage or we drain all of those dice. Now, because this die has 4 sides where it actually deals damage that you can choose to reroll, it has 1 miss and 1 kind of broken arrow that either you deal true damage or exhaust or drain this die, It means that on average it's actually not that powerful. I even asked ChatGPT to kind of do the formula and calculate the average damage if you would roll this over and over again, and the average damage is only 4. So it may seem not as nearly powerful as it can be. However, because we use our Bard innate ability that can reroll the die, this is where all the magic happens. Because you can, let's say if you roll this, and let me just show you how it works. You get 2, you roll again, that is another 2. That's a miss, and then we use our Bard reroll to hopefully reroll this again for some broken arrow. Well, we already used our Bard ability, innate ability, so we can't roll this anymore. So we can either choose to take 2 for damage or drain this die. And let's say in this case I want to drain this die, and because we have the tail of Bane, that's actually not a problem at all, because we can spend 2 tenacity and recover this die and roll it again and again and again. And that's kind of the main idea behind this build. We'll get back to Arrow Barrage once again, and there are some other ways to kind of amplify this rerolling mechanism even further, but for now let's just go to the level 4 die, which is Scatter Shot. It's the only option, and it says all damage dealt to your target this engage may also be dealt to another targetable enemy. Defense ignored as a result of snipe die may also be ignored for this enemy. And so just to show you how it works, let's say this is our character standing not adjacent to Breton Bandit anymore. It means we can normally roll, let's say, this snipe die against the Breton Bandit, but we can also add this scatter shot to our roll, and if it lands on this side, then we're lucky because this damage will also be dealt to another targetable enemy, which in this case is Orc Marauder. And as this effect states, the defense ignored as the result of snipe dice rolled for this engage also apply to another enemy. So if you, let's say, pierce kind of 2 defense for this engage for Breton Bandit, it goes exactly the same for Orc Marauder or for any other targetable enemy. So these snipe dice are pretty cute and all, but just imagine how crazy this might be if your roll is alongside Arrow Barrage. Then let's say it deals 2 damage, 2 more damage, and broken side we use our bot reroll and roll it again. That's another 2, so that's already 6 damage. And yeah, this is finally with training. And first of all, because we rolled the damage deal in phase 3 times, which means that was 6 damage, and because we're rolling this alongside scatter shot, that means both of these take 6 damage, which is already huge. Although of course, because we rolled this result at the end, we either taking true damage ourselves or draining these dice. And because it says that you drain all the dice rolled for this engage, it means both of these dice would be drained. So as you can already tell, this Arrow Barrage gets a little bit spicy when you combine this with the Bard innate ability, but we can go even further with that with some particular skill line. And that skill line is Light Armor. First of all, this skill line only comes with the Valenwood expansion, it doesn't come with the core box. And normally, whenever I make my builds, and you know, there are some skill lines that only comes from the expansions, I try to suggest some alternatives, some other ways to build your character with only using the core game skill lines. However, for this particular case, because we're trying to build such a unique build with kind of leaning heavily on the very specific kind of one feature of rerolling the die in order to amplify this Arrow Barrage, there is just no other skill line that can provide that. But first things first, level 1, we need to train at least 1 level 1 skill die in order to advance further. The options are either Grace or Spell Warding. Honestly, we don't really need any of those in particular. Grace provides a little bit more movement utility, but because we're gonna level up our stamina pretty heavily in order to roll more combat alongside the bow skill dice together, and as well as to increase our range, yeah, we're probably gonna have maybe 5 stamina, so we won't have a shortage of movement. And for Spell Warding, it's once per turn we can reduce damage taken, we can prevent 1 damage, which is pretty nice, not something we really need, again, particularly because we're playing with Imperial that we can prevent up to 3 damage once per battle. But yeah, I think this is it still provides a little bit better utility compared to Grace for our particular character. So you know what, I'm gonna slot in my Light Armor over here and train Grace simply, or sorry, not Grace, Spell Warding, simply because the other options is just not needed at all. I apologize that I went through level 1 skill dice so quickly, but honestly we don't really need them. At some point of the game you probably won't even be rolling them, so we can even untrain this if you want to, though you know, it doesn't hurt to sit in your slot. But what we really want is Enchant Weapon. This is where all the magic happens. So Enchant Weapon says, when engaging in any battle form other than Magicka, reduce this die by 1 to reroll any rolled skill die. If you do so, this engage ignores enemy skill Ethereal. And so the way all skill dice from the Light Armor skill line work is the following. First of all, they go to your active slots, so let's say this is our Enchant Weapon, let's say we rolled with this result with the number 3, it sits in our active slots, and whenever we roll die for our engage, we can reduce this by 1 to reroll 1 single die. Let me give you a quick demo, and let's say this is the skill dice that we want to roll for this engage, and let's say we're rolling and we've got damage, we've got this, we've got tenacity. Now we can reduce this enchant weapon die by 1, so it's now down to 2, and that means we can reroll this for free, basically still continue doing our engage. Oops, we rolled the broken arrow side, so we want to reduce this die again, this time to the value of 1, and we can roll this again, and yeah, well, again, broken arrow, what we can do, this now goes exhausted to our cooldown track, but we can still reroll again, and yeah, well, that's a damage deal inside, so that's what we want. And this is why this enchant weapon is so powerful. Not only you have your bard reroll, you can do once per turn for free, but you can also do this up to 3 times with your enchant weapon. This is so good. And so if this isn't crazy enough for you, there is another skill die from level 2 called Evocation. It says reduce this die by 1 to increase a different light armor die in any adventure active slot by 1. So now things get even crazier when you add Evocation to your active slot. And let's say we have, this is how the way we rolled our enchant weapon with a value of 1. It goes to our active slot, and then we roll Evocation, let's say with a number 3. And again, it goes to our active slot, that's how they both see it like that. And now we can reduce the Evocation die, let's say by 2, down to 2, to increase our enchant weapon up to 2. So that's how it works. You kind of adjusting the position of one skill die by altering the another one. We can now go down to 1 on the Evocation to increase our enchant weapon up to 3. So that is how it works. And so essentially, if you're lucky enough to have both your enchant weapon and your Evocation sitting at number 3 alongside your Bard reroll, that means you have 7 rerolls you can do per engage, which is just crazy. And if that wasn't enough, there is even another way to bring this even one step further. That is using the acrobatics skill line, which I'm gonna slot in over here. On the level 1 we have a single die, Fleet Phantom. While this die in your cooldown track, you may move up to X hexes at the start of your turn. So the way all acrobatics skill dice work is that they provide some kind of beneficial effect while sitting in your cooldown track. So let's say this Fleet Phantom, if we roll this with this face with a number 5, it goes to our cooldown track, and that means at the beginning of our turn, or rather actually before the beginning of our turn, we can move up to 5 hexes essentially for free, which doesn't count towards the limit of how we normally can move with our move action. So nothing too fancy with this skill line for now, and frankly we don't even need this, but bear with me, we'll get there. On the level 2 we have 3 options of Rapid Maneuver, Relentless and Windwalker. And again, I'm gonna cover all these options in more details when I'm gonna go over some other builds for other classes, but for this particular build, for this particular class, I'm just gonna slot in Windwalker, which says while this die in your cooldown track, your non-enduring class abilities cost X fewer tenacity to a minimum of 1. Remember that I said that our Bard is very power hungry, particularly because of the Tale of Sirabane that we're absolutely happy to use almost every turn, and also Battle of Glenumbra is a very strong ability, but it costs 5 tenacity, which sometimes a little bit tricky to get that amount, so this little die, Windwalker, definitely helps. While sitting in your cooldown track, it reduces the cost of your tenacity of your skills for this amount. So let's say if we have this number 2, it means our Battle of Glenumbra costs only 3 tenacity instead of 5, which is huge. And of course it makes our Tale of Sirabane cost just 1 tenacity, which is a huge difference between 1 and 2. Let's say if we trigger our Imperial Racial ability and we prevent 3 damage, and let's say we've gained 3 tenacity, with this Windwalker die sitting in our cooldown track, which means we're good for using the Tale of Sirabane for the next 3 turns, which is just awesome. Moving on to the level 3, we have Expert Evasion and Duelist Rebuff. And again, for this particular case, I'm just gonna slot in Expert Evasion without even talking through about the Duelist Rebuff, because I heard some feedback that my guides a little bit too long, so I'm gonna maybe try to make them a little shorter this time, and let's see. And Expert Evasion works this way. While this die in your cooldown track, if you are dealt damage, you may prevent all of the damage and immediately recover this die, and I'm talking about this arrow. This is the best phase we can get. Essentially, if we are dealt damage, we prevent all of this damage and this die instantly recovered, which is just absolutely amazing. On the other side, which is kinda not so good side, but still pretty useful, it says while this die in your cooldown track, when you are engaged by an enemy, you may gain up to 3 light fatigue, and for each fatigue gain, you may treat 1 enemy combat die as miss. So let's say we have this Expert Evasion for this particular phase sitting in our cooldown track, and let's say this Orc Marauder engages us, it comes closer, and let's say it rolls these very scary looking numbers 2 on each of these combat dice. And so what we can do, we can gain up to 2 light fatigue in this case, because there are 2 dice, and we can gain 2 light fatigue to essentially treat both of these dice as misses. So that's pretty nice. That's only kind of the only downside of this particular phase is that you gain in light fatigue, and obviously sometimes your cooldown track just cannot afford taking any more light fatigue. So yeah, this is kind of the best side you can get. If you reroll, this is even better, but yeah, other than that, this is still pretty okay too. So yeah, this is our expert evasion. And finally on to level 4, and frankly that is the single reason why we picked acrobatics, that is defiance. It says while this die in your cooldown track, once per engage, you may reroll any one of your skill dice that results in tenacity and miss. You still gain the tenacity from the initial result. So let's say we have this die sitting in our cooldown track, and let's say we roll arrow barrage, and let's say it landed on the miss side. Because we have this die in our cooldown track, we can reroll this for free in addition to our bard ability and enchant weapon and evocation, so we essentially +1 more extra reroll, and we even as a bonus gain, still gaining the tenacity from the miss side, so that's just icing on the cake. Yeah, really, just another reroll. Essentially this makes it up to a total of 8 rerolls that we can do per engage, per turn, depending with if you count with your bard ability, which is just absolutely crazy. Of course, by this point we should already have more stamina to move further and to target enemies at a further distance. I would say 4 is like a decent start, but maybe still try to get to 5 if you can, if you have enough experience. Now 1 extra health is kind of okay. It's not strictly needed because we are ranged damage dealing, and because we're probably going to be just annihilating most enemies, at least more threatening enemies, before they have a chance to attack us, and because we have our racial ability that can prevent 3 damage. Again, this extra health not needed, but still pretty okay to have. Of course, we definitely want to level up our cooldown. I would say 4 is a pretty comfortable spot for this build. If you can go up to 5, that's even better, but frankly I would not suggest going to 6, simply because we want to have our acrobatics skill die sitting in our cooldown track longer, because sometimes it might be a little bit awkward when you're recovering too much dice, sometimes when you want your defiance to sit actually long and you're recovering like, oh, I don't want to do that. So I think 5 is actually like probably the best spot you can have for this particular build. Now, if you still have experience even past that point, even though that was quite a lot of experience already, you can slot in a speech die, specifically the authority, to roll and give yourself even more tenacity when you need it. And even though this die is drained, remember that we can recover drained die, so it's a multi-use for our bard. Or if you want, you can simply slot in another snipe die, which I'm probably gonna do right now, although for the last gameplay portion of this video, probably gonna train this slot anyway, because that's probably too many experience already. If you have even more experience than that, you can slot in the last combat die over here. You don't need anything from the light armor skill line, so yeah, just combat die, really, that's all you need. And frankly, yeah, even not needed, strictly speaking. And just in case it wasn't really clear how ridiculously strong this build might get, let me show you kind of like a little bit of abstract demo. Just gonna roll all this arrow barrage die, and we're gonna count how much damage it can deal. Of course, provided that we have our light armor at the maximum values, as well as the defiance skill die sitting in our cooldown track. So without any edits, let's just count together. Let's say there is 1, there is 2, and a miss, so we're rerolling this for free. It goes like that to indicate it's kind of already used, but yeah, that was 2 times. Now it's another one, so I'm using my bard ability, and to do that I'm kind of, to indicate that I already used it, I put a health chip, so that was 2. Rerolling again, we've got 3, now we've got 4, and 5, and oops, miss. So I'm using my enchant weapon, and yeah, there was 5. That was, oops, broken arrow. I'm using my enchant weapon again. 5, we've got 6, we've got 7, we've got 8, we've got 9, we've got another miss. So you know what, I'm gonna use my evocation down to 1 to increase this light enchant weapon back to 3, and now I'm kind of using this enchant weapon again to reroll this one more time. That was 9, and that is 10. Because it deals 2 damage, that is already 20 damage. So I'm gonna continue rolling until we kind of deplete fully all our charges. So that is 11, that is 12, that is 13, and 14, and 15. Oh my god, that's 16. That is another miss. So I'm kind of depleting the last charge of my evocation, so it's no longer here. And we still have 2 charges of enchant weapon. So that was 16 if I'm not mistaken. I'm gonna hopefully count correctly. Yeah, another broken arrow, so we're gonna reduce this down to 1. Last try, but we have 16, that's already 32 damage. And another miss, so I'm rolling this again, kind of using this again. Yep, that's the last charge depleted. And let's see, that's 17 if I'm not mistaken. Okay, another broken arrow, and finally this skill is broken. So 17 times, that is 34 damage if I'm not mistaken. And you know what, the best part? Yeah, these get drained, but we're spending just 1 or 2 tenacity to recover this and roll this again. Just, oh my goodness, this is why it's so ridiculously strong. And just as a quick maybe a warning, spoilers, this build might make your game just feel too easy sometimes. So yeah, if you want to feel overpowered, this is a lot of fun. And I think this kind of the whole gambling idea of rolling this again and again is very much in line with the theme of Bard. It's kind of very thematic. But yeah, if you're playing an expert and if you're playing with all the rules applied correctly and you're playing true solo and you still find the game too easy, then my advice, just don't play this build, because that's just hilariously strong. Now let's have a look at some items synergistics with this build and how we can enhance this even further. And the first one is Silver Circlet. You probably see a pattern that I kind of recommend in this item pretty much all of my builds. I think it's no surprise, and this item is just so good. So for 2 tenacity interrupt, after rolling, change a single level 1 or skill or level 2 skill die to the side of your choice. And of course, even though we have our Bard's innate ability that allow us to reroll the die that we want, it's still not as strong as changing the die to the side of your choice, obviously. And because we rely on so heavily on 2 particular skill level 2 skill dice from the light armor, these are evocation and enchant weapon, we really need to make sure they land on the side that we want. This item is the key. Now, if you don't have this item, it's not that much a problem, because you can hopefully still use your Bard's innate ability to reroll the die and hopefully get some better result. But it's just much nicer to change the side of your choice with this item. And honestly, I think because this build is so strong on its own, it's kind of very items independent. But like if you have this Silver Circlet, it's obviously amazing. But if you don't have this one, and if you don't have any other items whatsoever, this build still performs very strong. So yeah, I think all other items that I will gonna show you here are just honestly just icing on the cake. You don't really need them per se, but it's just little nicer to have them, if you will. So one of those kind of nice to have items is this instrument. It says when any adventurer gains a sky shard, you gain 1 tenacity. You may instead choose to discard this item to ignore the sky shard effect on a dealt card. And if you are a bard, this item may be used even if in your pack. Now, there are a couple of instruments in this game that specifically can provide additional bonuses if you are playing bard, which obviously is pretty nice, though most of them kind of useful only when you're playing on a support character. This particular instrument, however, I think is pretty useful even if you're playing in true solo, just gaining more tenacity. And yeah, as I've already mentioned a couple of times, bards is very power hungry, very tenacity hungry. You always want to use this every single turn, so more tenacity is good. And especially since you're gaining this for free essentially whenever you gain a scar shard, yeah, it's pretty nice. Also going with the theme of tenacity, we have a chest called House Hexus Kiras. It's a chest item, legendary piece. It says after an enemy engages you, gain 1 tenacity. Again, something that necessarily not strictly needed, but it's pretty nice to have. The more tenacity we have, the more we can use our Tale of Cerebane, as well as the interrupt, and yeah, just more tenacity for the god of tenacity. This is really nice. Now, there are a couple of bows. One of them is Bow of the Deadlands. It's a legendary bow. It says if this is your first engage this turn, increase your range by 4. Now, increasing range by 4 is pretty nice when you need to deal with some enemies, maybe at the end of the delve or maybe in a dungeon. Of course, provided that those enemies are still inside, but maybe they are on the very far end of the large hex, and maybe they are very dangerous enemies. Maybe they have range of 7 or 8, which is normally more than you have, so you want to eliminate them quickly without moving. That is pretty nice. However, I should say that most of the time for your first engage, you want to make sure that you have your light armor up and that you have your acrobatic skills down in your cooldown track. So the fact that it works only on the first engage, sometimes actually not that helpful, but yeah, other than that, pretty good item. The second bow option is Knightwood Bow. It's a common bow, which says for this engage, if it includes no combat skill dice, increase your range by 2. Now, Bow of the Deadlands increases the range by 4, which is slightly nicer. However, because as I mentioned it only works for the second engage, I think Knight with Bow is slightly more reliable. It's actually pretty rarely that we're gonna use combat skill dice, especially once the whole build is complete. We're mostly rolling on arrow barrage, that's all we frankly care about. This essentially bonus always applies, so we have almost extra 2 range, which is pretty nice. I think it's even might be better than the Bow of Deadlands. And finally, for the more like pure fun category, we have Signet of the Worm. It's a ring which says discard this item before rolling during an engage. All damage dealt to your target this engage is also dealt to all other targetable enemies. So yeah, just imagine all those absolutely crazy numbers that you roll with arrow barrage, and we're talking about 10 or 20, sometimes 30 damage that can be dealt to all targetable enemies, especially combined with the, Bow of the Deadlands or Knight with Bow, so that potentially a range of 7 or even more than that, and that's all enemies basically will be defeated in a single engage. Now, one quick important warning for this particular item: it may feel a little bit anticlimactic, especially if you are playing with other players. Just imagine you are in the final dungeon, in the session 3, and you're using this item and you're essentially just defeating pretty much all enemies in a single engage. It just might feel a little bit frustrating for other players. And even if you're playing solo, I would say this also might feel a little bit like too overpowered, so yeah. I think this build itself is already too strong, like borderline OP, and this item just makes it even more ridiculous, so yeah. It's purely, for the fun category, but other than that, be cautious that you've been warned. Alright, and finally, now let me give you a little bit more of realistic gameplay, how this class and build actually would play, with actually rolling the die and resolving, and with actual enemies on the field. And so for this purpose I created this kind of demo clash battle scene, and first of all I apologize that not the entire clash fits into the screen, unfortunately that's just the limitation of my current filming setup. And also, if I calculated correctly, my enemy pool is 39, because that's how much experience needed in order to advance my character to this stage. So for the enemy pool of 39, we have a level 20 Goblin Butcher with a Disrupt, Maim and Rot, 4 combat dice, really scary one dude. And we have level 10 Conjured Cultist with Intimidate and Ritual. Intimidate is, by the way, is a really kind of weak point of our class, because we don't have any way of removing the status die, so if we get Fear in our cooldown track, then we are in trouble. And then we have a level 5. Our friend again is back, Orc Marauder. I genuinely pulled them randomly from the bag, but yeah, sometimes you see them over and over again. Next we have 4 level 1 enemies, which are Wolf with a Repost. Then we have Skeleton with no enemy skills, but with 2 defense, which is the only level 1 enemy with 2 defense. And then we have Breton Bandit, yeah, again our old friend, as well as the High Elf Bandit over there. Alright, so it's a round 1, beginning of adventurer's turn, it's my turn, and well, you're starting from complete scratch with no tenacity, no items, nothing at all. And keep in mind that normally those light armor dice, they can persist in your active slots between battle, which normally is very helpful, but because I'm starting with complete scratch, that means I need to roll them over and over again. That means I need to roll my acrobatic dice first, I need to roll my light armor before I could use my actual damage dealing skill dice, which is a little bit unfortunate, because generally speaking you would want the other way around. You want first to deal the damage with your kind of main skill lines, and then you would roll acrobatics to stay longer in your cooldown. So this beginning of the battle, when all of your skill dice are available, is a little bit awkward moment for this class, but maybe it's actually would be a good opportunity to showcase that as well. So as my first engage, I want to put my acrobatics skill line in the cooldown, so they would start providing benefits, but if specifically for this level 4 dice, so I could have one more extra reroll. And taking this opportunity, I think I'm gonna roll this volley die as well to hopefully deal some damage to the wolf and also to move for free essentially. So because my stamina is 5, I can roll 5 dice, so I'm gonna take volley alongside all of this acrobatic skill line, and let's see what we get. Alright, and we've got the miss on the most important skill dice, which is this one. Oh, that's a bit unfortunate. Now the question is, do I even want to use my bard reroll now or to save it for light armor? Now that is the real question, and I think I'm gonna use it now. So I'm using my bard reroll, innate ability, and yes, we've got when you need it. Also gain 1 tenacity, which is not that bad, as well as the evasion die, which is like the best side you can get, as well as the 2 face side of this Windwalker. So can't complain, honestly. And yeah, I think I'm gonna resolve them in this order. I'm just gonna put this dice, sorry, that was actually 5, though it doesn't matter. I'm gonna keep my expert evasion like that, as well as this die, and that was my first engage. And yeah, of course I gained 1 tenacity because of this miss. Next, I would love to target this Khajiit cultist as well as this goblin butcher, because they're definitely the scariest enemies on the field, because I have range of 5, which means I need to make a few steps closer, otherwise I wouldn't be able to reach out cultist. And of course I could potentially stay here on the entrance tile and just kind of dealing with those enemies first, because those enemies, they don't have a long range, so that could be an option. But you know what, just for the sake of this video, just for the sake of fun, I'll try to go all in, coming closer, making 1, 2 steps. That should be enough now to reach the Khajiit cultist. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep, that should do it. But before rolling my damage dealing skills, I still need to make 1 engage to put my light armor up. So I'm switching to magic battle form, and I'm gaining 2 light fatigue because I'm playing on the expert difficulty, and also because my magic stat is also only 2. I can roll only 2 of the skill dice, but frankly I don't even need this one. So I'm rolling enchant weapon alongside evocation, and fingers crossed for some good results. So let's see what we get. And that is nearly perfect. We have 3 on enchant weapon and 2 on our evocation. So I'm putting them in my active slots, just like so, and now we are ready for our main damage dealing engage. So now I'm switching back to my ranged battle form. I'm gaining 2 more light fatigue for the extra engage, and now the question is, what dice exactly do I want to roll? Remember, the caveat of Arrow of Barrage is that if it lands on the broken arrow side, you must either take 2 true damage or drain all dice that you roll for this engage, which means if I can roll potentially all of these dice together, but if it lands on the broken arrow side, that means I'm gonna drain all of these 4 dice potentially, which would be quite nasty. But you know what, I think I'll try to play safely, and I'm just gonna roll the Arrow Barrage alongside this second target damage. So let's see how it goes. And remember that I have I already used my Bard's Engage, Bard's reroll, but I have another 5 rerolls from here, and another one from my cooldown track if it lands on the miss side. So alright, wish me luck. I'm targeting Goblin Butcher alongside the Khajiit cultist if it lands on the second target. Alright, we've got our second target, but Arrow Barrage landed on the broken side right away. So yeah, definitely gonna use my first enchant weapon to decrease this to 2 and roll this again. And that's, wow, that's first damage, 2 damage in fact. So you know what, just for the sake of simplicity, let's count how many sides are gonna land on this face rather than counting damage. So 1, and keep rolling, 2, keep rolling, 3, keep rolling, miss. And because we have miss, we have this die in our cooldown track. Not only we gaining free tenacity, but also we can reroll this for free, but only 1 time per engage. So we have 3 times it landed on the damage side, and we keep rolling, and we have another miss. So this time I have to use already my enchant weapon. It's now down to 1, and I'm using again, and that is 4. Now that is 5. Is this enough to defeat it? No, we need to keep rolling, and that's another miss. So you know what, I'm using my evocation down to 0, so I'm exhausting my evocation to increase this back to 3, and now I'm reducing down to 2 to reroll this miss. So that was 4 or 5? I think that was 4 probably, or 5. Dang, I should have counted my fingers or something. But actually I'm rolling again. Yeah, that's another, and if that's 5, that would not be enough to defeat this Goblin Butcher, because it has 9 health and 2 shields, so I need 1 more land like that in order to defeat those both. So let's give it a try. Yep, and another one. That definitely should do it. I'm gonna see on the edit, or while I'll be editing the video, how much times it landed, but I'm pretty sure this is now 6, which means that is 12 damage, which means that is enough to defeat this huge stack of Goblin Butcher's health alongside this Khajiit cultist, because we have this double target essentially. So yeah, they both defeated. These dice go to my cooldown track because they are not drained, luckily, and I even still have 1 die left, 1 slot left in my cooldown track. Now it's enemy's turn, starting with the highest level, Orc Marauder, to move 2 steps closer to me and roll in 2 combat dice. And let's see what we get. So that is 3 damage, which I definitely don't want to take, but because we have expert evasion sitting in our cooldown track, we can just safely prevent all of this damage and instantly recover this die back to our available slots. So that was Orc's Marauder's turn. Next we have Wolf, dealing, also rolling the same 2 dice. Let's see what we get. And we have the same result, 3. And you know what? Probably gonna use just my racial ability, because I actually want this time to gain 3 tenacity. So I'm preventing 3 damage and gaining 3 tenacity, which means I'm now sitting at 5, which might come in handy for this ability. Alright, now Breton's bandit turn. They're moving closer and they're rolling 1 die. I no longer have any way to prevent damage, so I'm hoping for a miss or something. Yeah, well, 1 damage, you know what. I'm fine with it, I'll take it. So 1 damage away from my health chip. Now High Elf Bandit, it has a range of 4, which means it needs to move closer. 1, 2, and still 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, and actually now in range. Perfect, so it strikes for 1. I'm fine with taking 1 more health chip away from my character. And finally this skeleton, they actually, the all invalid hex that can attack from is this one, so they just trying to walk around alongside their allies like so. And that is the end of enemy's activation turn. Now the beginning of round 2, it's my turn again. Now I'm recovering 5 dice, which is up to this one, and that's actually not enough for me to deal damage, because my most needed die is here. I could have taken out from my cooldown track last turn, but I wouldn't be able to fit this as another engage because of the fatigue in my cooldown track. Just removing fatigue, putting this back dice like so. And you know what, I think I'm gonna stay in my ranged battle form, and I want to apply these dice again. Maybe I don't even need some extra. I'm just gonna roll these 2 dice alongside volley and hopefully maybe defeat a wolf if this would land on the side I need. So let's see how it goes. My first engage, and yeah, okay. Wow, both misses on this one. This is pretty bad. I think I'm gonna use my Bard's innate ability to reroll this die again, because I really need this side. So let's see how it goes. And yes, we've got it. So first of all, I'm resolving volley die, dealing 4 damage to wolf. Remember that I can distribute 4 damage as I please to adjacent enemies, but because I think it would be wiser to focus on only 1 enemy, so yeah, 4 damage goes to wolf, which is exactly how much needed in order to defeat it. Now I can also move myself 2 to 4 hexes away, and you know what, I'm just gonna stay maybe 1 to hexes. Yeah, that should do it. So just I'll be able to use my snipe dice against those enemies, because I wouldn't be able to do this while they are adjacent. So this die is resolved, and yeah, this one stays in my cooldown track, and so this one, and I don't even need extra tenacity. That's a bit unfortunate. I probably should have used my, definitely I should have used my Tale of Sirobane ability before rolling the die. So that was a little bit unfortunate. Alright, and now I have a couple of options. I think my option number 1 would be to use my Tale of Sirobane for 2 tenacity to recover my arrow barrage and hopefully deal some crazy damage again, though this time it probably wouldn't be as crazy because I have only 2 charges left in my enchant weapon. Or my other option would be to use Battle for Glenombre Moors to kind of grant myself another extra turn, and because of that that means I would recover, first of all I would remove all light fatigue from a cooldown track and also recover 5 dice, which is, you know what, I think is actually the best case in this particular case, especially since I'm sitting at 5 tenacity anyway. So yeah, I'm using my 5 tenacity to use my Battle of Glenombre Moors. That means I'm removing light fatigue from my cooldown track and I'm recovering these 5 dice. So basically everything except this one, which is frankly exactly what's needed. So this goes here, and acrobatics go here. Now, the question is, do I want to roll evocation first, just to be safe? And I think the answer is yes. So I'm gonna switch to battle form, and because it's the beginning of new turn for me, I'm not gaining fatigue, because that's essentially a free engage. And taking this opportunity, since I already have my enchant weapon sitting in the active slots, I'm gonna roll this spell warden dice as well, because why not? Why wasting rolling slots? So let's see how it goes. Okay, perfect actually. Perfect number 3, as well as this one, with my help to prevent a little bit damage. This might come in handy, so I'm resolving this one like so. They're just sitting in my active slots. Now I think I'm gonna switch to ranged battle form and gain 2 light fatigue for doing extra engage. And yeah, I think I'm just gonna roll. I'm gonna roll the arrow barrage alongside scatter arrow, targeting Orc Marauder. and let's see what we get. And that is perfect, exactly what needed. So we can now target another targetable enemy. Let's see if we can get this high elf bandit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, we can target that. So that would be our second target. And now let's count how many times we're gonna roll this result on arrow barrage. 1 so far. And that broken arrow, wow. Well, let's use our enchant weapon. And now it's down to 1. Let's keep rolling. 2, 3. That's miss. That we can treat for free, essentially gaining 1 tenacity while still gaining extra reroll, because we have this die in our cooldown track, which is awesome. So we had 3. Now let's keep rolling. That is 4. And that actually should be already enough to defeat Orc Marauder, because it has 8. It has 6 health and 2 defense. That essentially 8 health, and that is already enough to defeat this bad boy. And alongside, of course, Elf Bandit, High Elf Bandit, because we have Scatter Shot. So just like so, both of these enemies are now defeated. And I think it would be nice to recover this arrow barrage again, but for that I need 1 extra tenacity. So you know what, if I roll this Windwalker on either the side actually, if I roll miss, then it means I'll get tenacity anyway to use my Tales of Sirobane, and if I land this on any of these like proper sides, that means I'll be able to reduce my cost of tenacity down to 1, so this means I'll be able to use my ability anyway, which is awesome. So let me just take another engage. You know what, I could have used some bow skill dice alongside for this roll, but I honestly don't even need this, so yeah, just make an extra engage, roll in only my acrobatic skill dice. Let's see what we get. Alright, we have 2 misses, which is honestly not that bad, but because we have this skill dice in our cooldown track, I can reroll one of them for free while still gaining the tenacity. So gaining tenacity, and I'm rerolling this die, hopefully for some better result. No, still tenacity, well, whatever. Yeah, so I'm now gaining 1 extra tenacity alongside all of these dice in my cooldown track. They are resolved like so. I think I'm gonna put this one first, because I wanted to recover first. Alright, so now I have 3 tenacity, which means I can spend at least 2 of them for Tale of Sirobane. Choose an adventure insight. The adventure recovers 1 trained or exhausted die. So yeah, definitely spending 2 tenacity to recover my arrow barrage again. And now I'm using another engage, hopefully targeting this Breath and Bandit. Hopefully that will be enough to defeat it. Let's see what we get. Okay, 1, 2, and 1 more should do it. Yeah, so that is 2 times 3, that's 6 damage. That is already enough to defeat Breath and Bandit, just like so. This die go to my cooldown track, and yeah, honestly I didn't mind finishing the turn by even staying like that, even though I couldn't move if I needed. So yeah, now this poor baby skeleton's turn. It attacks me with a single combat die for 1 damage, but I can even prevent that damage thanks to my spell warden. So I'm just reducing this down to 2 and preventing all of that damage. Wow, I feel bad for the skeleton. Now the beginning of round 3. I'm recovering 5 dice, moving 3 light fatigue to the supply, and this dice like so. And so you know what, I think just rolling a single volley die should do it actually. Yeah, I'm gonna roll it alongside my acrobatic skill. And that is 4 damage, which is totally enough to go through even 2 armor and still doing 2 damage to the skeleton. And well, that's the end of this fight. Honestly, as I told you before, the damage you can deal with this arrow barrage is absolutely ridiculous. So if you are complaining about the game is too easy already, again, provided that you are playing on true solo, on expert difficulty, and applying all rules correctly, but if you still find the game too easy, just don't play on this character. On the other hand, if you don't mind feeling a little bit overpowered sometimes, then trust me, this build is tons of fun. And I think it's very thematic with the bard's nature, you know, that you're gambling, should I roll 1 more time or should I stay? You know, should I leave my damage like that? So yeah, I think this is hilarious build and I love it. And that's a wrap for today's video. This class, guys, take quite a bit of time and effort to put together, so if you found this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe for more board gaming content. And if you would like to support the channel directly, you can also do this over on Patreon, and it really means a lot to me. And well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.